These are not stories of glory or victory. They are the voices of real soldiers, men whose accounts I've read and studied over the years. They fought in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the burning cities of France, and on the frozen fields of the Ardennes. Some were tankers, others Panzergrenadiers, some barely more than boys. All of them left behind fragments of memory, moments of survival, of terror, of pointless death. Today, I want to tell their stories. Brutal, unfiltered confessions from the Western Front. Accounts of Canadians pushing through the bocage, of American tanks grinding forward through villages, of Army and SS men retreating under fire, starving, abandoned, left only with their fear and their rifles. This is not strategy, this is not myth. This is what it felt like to be there, in the mud, under the shell fire, as the Western Front collapsed. As soon as the invasion of Normandy began, our division was pulled out of the meat grinder on the Eastern Front and rushed to the west. We'd been fighting Soviets for years, but now, in the chaos of June 1944, we were thrown straight into battle against British units pressing southwest of Caen. The contrast was staggering. Gone were the endless Russian plains. Now we found ourselves in a patchwork of bocage hedgerows, narrow lanes, and fortified villages that seemed ready to swallow entire battalions. Because I had learned a bit of English in secondary school, I was assigned to help run a makeshift prisoner collection point near the front, just behind Hill 188, which at the time was being bitterly contested. The village was deserted, ghostly. With artillery howling over the rooftops and planes circling above, we scavenged through empty farmhouses until we found one with a deep cellar, sturdy enough to hold prisoners and maybe shield us from the constant shelling. Soon the prisoners arrived, young British lads, not much older than we were. Most were shaken but relieved. They knew their war was over. I tried to speak to them in my broken English, and to my surprise, they spoke back. Tired faces, pale from fear, yet calm. In the depths of that cellar, as shells cracked overhead and dust rained from the beams, we spoke of ordinary things. How pointless it all felt. The war, the uniforms, the endless mud. For a brief moment, in that damp darkness, we weren't enemies, just boys caught in the gears of something far larger than us. For 2 days the shelling didn't stop. We couldn't leave the cellar. Then new prisoners arrived. Some were injured, some crying. We had no medical staff, no food supplies, just rations we scavenged and shared. During that 14-day span, I met men from all over, from Scotland to New Zealand, each with stories, jokes, dreams. And all of it ended here, in the dirt-floored gloom of a Norman basement. I often took 2 of them with me when I ventured out for supplies. We would creep through ruins, half expecting a sniper's bullet or a sudden blast of shrapnel. One day, as we approached a collapsed barn, an artillery shell landed 50 meters away. The concussion flung us backwards. One of the prisoners was hit, bleeding from the neck. He cried out for his mother. I remember pressing a rag to the wound, whispering something, anything, to calm him. I don't know if he heard, but he survived. That night, transport finally arrived, and the prisoners were taken away. I never saw them again. Some of us kept photos, souvenirs, little keepsakes from men we barely knew. We'd look at them when the noise died down, huddled in a corner of the cellar, wondering who would be next. We were all in the same boat, prisoners of the front. By late August 1944, it was over. Our tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. Fuel had run dry. The once proud columns of the Waffen-SS were now scattered bands of desperate men, hiding in woods, crawling through hedgerows, trying to reach German lines that no longer existed. We were trapped in the Falaise Pocket, surrounded, pounded from the air and the ground, and shelled without mercy. Resistance was useless. There were no orders anymore, no lines to hold. Everyone was on their own. Eventually, we were fired on by British tanks as we tried to flee. Not out of cruelty, but because in that chaos, no one could tell who was surrendering and who was still fighting. I remember waving a white cloth tied to a broken rifle, my hands shaking as those great steel beasts closed in. We were deep inside enemy territory, cut off and armed with barely anything. So we laid down our weapons and surrendered, That was 21st August 1944. Our war was over. The division had been ordered to Normandy back in mid-June. It took 10 days to transport our men and equipment across France, and already by then the situation was deteriorating. The fighting was relentless. Narrow lanes, hedgerows, towns reduced to rubble. Our radios buzzed day and night with reports of heavy casualties. For us in the signals detachment, we were often close to the front, relaying orders, under constant risk of artillery and strafing runs. Once, for a short period, we had a captured Canadian pilot with us. He was placed in our radio truck, not as a threat, but as a temporary guest, because we had no means to transport him anywhere else. For those 2 days, he sat among us, ate our rations, and shared in the same danger. He spoke a bit of German, and we found ourselves talking with him more than we expected. Not as enemies, but as men caught in the same machine. Before he left, he turned to us and said he was glad we had taken him prisoner, and not someone else. He had heard the stories, he had feared the worst, but we treated him as we treated each other. I remember showing him one of our spare tunics, the SS runes still faintly visible on the collar. His face changed, not with fear, but confusion. His expression said everything. What he had been told and what he had seen no longer matched. Among Allied soldiers, the Waffen-SS had a reputation of being merciless, unrelenting. Some of it was earned, some of it was myth. What most people don't understand is that brutality wasn't a uniform trait. It was situational. It depended on the man, the moment, and the place. In our case, there was no cruelty in those days. Just fatigue, confusion, and the fading hope that we might make it out of Normandy alive. For all the myths, the black uniforms, the iron discipline, the propaganda, many of us were just trying to survive. On the first day of the invasion, our orders were simple. Move up fast, reinforce the front, hold the line. None of us really understood what was happening. Just hours earlier, we had been resting near Lisieux, playing cards in a barn. Then the orders came. The Allies had landed. By dawn, we were packed into trucks, rumbling through country roads under a sky already buzzing with aircraft. The first casualties came before we even saw the enemy. Fighter bombers screamed down on our convoy in tight formation, their machine guns stitching the hedgerows with fire. One vehicle took a direct hit and burst into flames, sending a plume of black smoke into the sky. I remember seeing a boot, just one, lying in the road with no body nearby. My hands were shaking as I clutched my rifle, but I kept telling myself it was all just nerves, that it would pass. Our destination was the outskirts of Caen, though I never knew the exact name of the district. By the time we arrived, the city was already half destroyed. British bombers had flattened entire blocks, turning elegant stone buildings into craters and skeletal ruins. Smoke hung in the air, thick and chemical, coating your throat until you felt like choking. We moved through the rubble like ghosts, hollow-eyed, silent, half expecting a sniper round at any moment. The civilians were gone, just cats and shattered glass. For about a month, we held those positions, shifting between ruined villas, basements, and abandoned cafes. At night, we slept in collapsed garages, the smell of mildew and rotting plaster clinging to our uniforms. It was quieter than I expected. No great charges, no dramatic battles, just the constant pressure of enemy artillery and the slow erosion of morale. But then the real collapse came. When the Allies broke through south of Caen and began circling around Falaise, it became clear we weren't going to hold the line. By mid-August, the situation had disintegrated into chaos. Our division was being split and scattered, and small Kampfgruppen were being formed from whatever men and equipment remained. I was assigned to one such group, composed of barely 20 soldiers, most of them younger than I was. Some were just 17. We were told to hold a section of the town of Falaise, a cluster of buildings around a school called the École Supérieure. It was just another name on a map, but that place would become the end of the line for many of us. We arrived at night under the cover of shadows and smoke. The streets were cratered, the lampposts snapped in half like broken matchsticks. There were still fires smouldering from the day before. Inside the school, desks had been pushed into barricades, chalkboards smashed. I took position near a second-floor window, just behind a heavy machine gun. We rigged a sandbag wall and pointed it at the road below. There was an orchard across the street and a tall brick house with shattered shutters. We knew the Canadians were coming from that direction. That night, we barely slept. You could hear them, boots on cobblestones, foreign voices barking orders, the dull rattle of equipment being moved. Every so often, tracer fire lit up the dark, skipping across the road like red sparks. I remember seeing shadows dart between the buildings opposite us, followed by muffled shots. At one point, a grenade exploded on the ground floor, sending dust raining from the ceiling. We thought they were already inside. Everyone froze. Then silence again. At dawn, it started. They came in force, small units, probing attacks at first, trying to draw our fire. We shot back, of course, but it was difficult. Smoke from earlier fighting had fogged up the air, and our machine gun jammed twice in the first hour. One of our boys, Muller, leaned out to clear the jam and caught a bullet in the throat. He dropped with a gurgling sound, blood pooling into his collar as we dragged him back by the boots. We tried to stop the bleeding with a dirty bandage, but it was useless. He was dead within minutes. By mid-morning, they had made it to the building opposite. We could see their helmets through the windows, moving from room to room. They were disciplined, not rushing, not panicking, just tightening the noose around us. That was when I started to understand we wouldn't be getting out. There was no radio contact, no reinforcements, no orders. Just scattered men, an abandoned school, and a growing ring of Canadian soldiers closing in. I can still remember the orchard trees outside, their branches sagging under the weight of unpicked fruit. A strange, almost peaceful sight in the middle of all that hell. And I remember thinking, this is it, this is where I'm going to die. Inside the school, the wounded lay silent, some drifting between life and death. We had taken a Canadian prisoner the day before, and strangely, he was the one now helping treat our injured, assisting our SS medic with whatever tools and rags we could scrounge from the ruins. Among the wounded was another Canadian, badly hurt and slipping fast. In a moment of strange, quiet humanity, our medic daubed a red cross on a white sheet with blood, then used it to cover himself and the prisoner. Under this makeshift flag, they carried the man across the street during a rare pause in the fighting. The enemy let them pass. Our medic became a prisoner that day, but not through capture. He gave himself up to save a life, and a few hours later, he was returned to us. War is strange like that. You kill men in the morning and save them in the evening. But by then, we all knew. The situation was hopeless. The Canadians had surrounded the entire sector. Our ammunition was running out. Our radio batteries were dead. No one knew what was happening beyond a few hundred meters. So, on the evening of August 17th, we made our move. Through the orchard, we crept, silent and tense, past the rows of gnarled apple trees and shattered fences. We stopped once to say goodbye to the wounded. They would not be coming with us. Our medic volunteered to stay with them. He nodded once, lit a cigarette, and disappeared into the dark schoolhouse as we slipped into the night. The street was deadly. The moment we stepped out, tracer fire zipped through the darkness. Bullets sparked off the stone walls and shattered window panes above our heads. We dove into the nearest ruined house and waited for dawn, crammed into what used to be a family's dining room, surrounded by broken plates and overturned chairs. It was quiet, but only just. You could still hear the tanks breathing down the street. Just after sunrise, the sky roared, and we looked up to see German aircraft overhead. A rare sight. A miracle, almost. While the enemy scrambled to respond, we ran. We ducked through alleys, across gardens, over barbed fences. Our boots were falling apart. The sweat stung our eyes. We had no water left, no food. By midday, we were only 18 men. The others had either been hit or scattered. Eventually, we came to a small farmhouse. The shutters were closed, but smoke curled gently from the chimney. We knocked, explained who we were, and the old farmer let us in. His wife brought bread and thin soup. We sat at the wooden table like schoolboys, exhausted, barely speaking. But the silence didn't last long. Within the hour, we heard the sound of vehicles outside, and then came the voice, not German, but English. The farmer had betrayed us, maybe to save his own life, maybe for revenge, maybe just for food. I don't know. All I remember is the rifle in my back as we were marched out into the yard, hands on our heads. That was the moment I realized what we'd been trapped in, the Falaise Pocket. It was the late afternoon of the 5th of July when the order came. I was to support the regiment's withdrawal by setting up an MG-42 and covering their retreat. The command came from Oberleutnant Kaminski. No time for questions, no room for hesitation. I was issued the gun, a runner from the 13th Company joined me, and we set off toward the abbey, that massive stone relic that now sat at the edge of a battlefield, crumbling under the pressure of artillery shells and the distant thunder of approaching tanks. I slung 300 rounds of ammunition over my shoulders, looped another belt into the breech, and stepped into what felt like the last act of a long and bloody play. We moved in short bursts, hugging shattered walls and hopping over debris-strewn streets. Shells rained intermittently on the abbey as we advanced. The closer we got, the more intense the noise became. Bricks cracked, glass exploded overhead, and wooden beams groaned as they sagged under stress. Smoke curled out from a nearby ammunition dump that had been hit earlier. There was no more time to think. I pushed through the northwestern arch of the abbey and found myself facing a low stone wall. Beyond that was an open meadow bordered by a thick hedge. It looked calm, eerily so. I glanced behind. My number 3 man was about 50 meters back, running with his head ducked low. I decided to scout ahead to see what lay beyond the hedge line, so I climbed over the wall and started moving through the knee-high grass. Halfway across the field, the illusion of calm shattered. Gunfire cracked, sharp, close. I dropped flat, heart pounding, feeling the grass twitch beside my face as bullets zipped past. I heard Hampel's voice behind me, shouting, "Erhard, come back! Come back!" I didn't respond. I couldn't. I crawled to the hedge, pushed the barrel of the MG-42 through the leaves, and scanned for movement. Nothing, just fields and ruins, and the ever-present hum of distant engines. I chambered around and waited. Eventually, we linked back up. The others moved in behind cover while I held the position. By nightfall, the meadow had turned into no man's land. We were now fully encircled. Enemy patrols were closing in, our lines had dissolved, and the abbey itself, once a stronghold, was now a trap. The decision was made to retreat under cover of darkness. We moved slowly, hugging walls, ducking through orchards, always just one step ahead of enemy fire. At one point we found a ruined villa and decided to rest for a few hours. No food, barely any water, but at least the gunfire had stopped. That night, while scouting ahead, I saw them, enemy soldiers, advancing quietly through the mist. I didn't fire. We had nothing left to fight with, just silence and the smell of cordite in the air. By the end of that week, our unit, once hundreds strong, was down to barely a couple dozen men. The abbey was lost. Most of our officers had vanished. We later learned they'd already withdrawn and left us to cover the rear, or die trying. I remember standing beside my motorcycle in the twilight, the last traces of daylight disappearing behind the hills. The MG-42 was empty. My boots were soaked. My hands were cracked and blackened from powder burns. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and yet, somehow, I was still alive. On the 18th of July 1944, I found myself rolling toward the front in a Panzer IV, one of just 25 tanks left in our battered battalion. It was early morning when we left the village of Bully-sur-Orne, moving toward the front lines near Tilly-la-Campagne. I was only 19 years old, and strangely, in a division where many were even younger, I was considered one of the old men of the crew. We arrived in what looked like a ghost village, every house shattered, every window gone. Trees had been reduced to black stumps. The air was already heavy with dust and gunpowder. We drove slowly through the wreckage, guided by radio instructions, weaving between craters and overturned wagons. Our orders were to support infantry elements retreating through the sector and prepare for a possible counterattack. We pulled up near an orchard on the eastern edge of town, engines idling, and then shut down. It was quiet, too quiet, and that silence always meant danger. I positioned my tank behind a half-collapsed farmhouse next to a garden wall and camouflaged it as best I could with branches and torn netting. I could hear the voices of other tank crews nearby, laughing nervously, trying to push back the fear. But it was no use. The sounds around us changed, the whistle of air overhead, the dull thump of distant shells. Artillery was being repositioned. They were zeroing in. On the 22nd of July, the storm began. The barrage lasted almost 2 hours, and it felt like 2 days. British and Canadian artillery fired non-stop, a mixture of high explosive and phosphorus rounds. Our tank shook with each impact, the steel creaking and echoing with every blast. The heat was suffocating. Trapped inside our vehicle with no airflow, the temperature climbed rapidly. I was seated just behind the engine, drenched in sweat, unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. The smell of fuel, hot metal, and fear was everywhere. One by one, the tank crew fell silent, not from sleep or calm, but from the sheer, crushing weight of exhaustion and dread. Our ears rang constantly. The roof above us flexed with pressure, and we were told not to speak unless absolutely necessary. One loud word might be the last thing we heard. Every so often, I wiped condensation from my vision block just to see if the house we were parked behind was still standing. Eventually, it wasn't. A direct hit obliterated the upper floors, showering our turret in bricks and tiles. We thought the next shell would hit us directly. By the time the shelling stopped, the village was a ruin. Nearly every house was flattened. The orchard we had used as cover was just smoke and splinters. Our infantry support had taken severe losses. We radioed for orders, but the signal was too weak. Most of our commanders were either dead or had fallen back. We were stranded. That night, we sat inside the Panzer like animals in a steel cage. We couldn't sleep, we couldn't stretch, we just waited. There was no clean water, no chance to remove our sweat-soaked uniforms. We hadn't washed in days. Our boots were soaked in oil and blood. Still, no one spoke of surrender, not once. We had long passed the point of comfort. Now it was about survival, nothing more. On 25th July, the bombardment began at precisely 0600 hours, straight from the air. We heard them before we saw them, the low hum of engines that turned into a scream. The target was about 2 kilometers from our village, but it felt like it was on top of us. The attack lasted for 2 hours, and we were told it involved around 70 bombers. It was relentless. The sky was torn open by wave after wave of aircraft, and the earth shook under their payloads. Even inside a Tiger tank, you could feel the shockwave rumble through your chest. Roof tiles exploded like shrapnel, trees collapsed into the roads, and entire buildings vanished in plumes of smoke and flying timber. It was the worst bombardment I had ever witnessed, and I'd seen plenty on the Eastern Front, but that was only the beginning. That was the aerial phase. What followed was a storm of artillery. Shells poured in from every direction, British, Canadian, American. The fire came in patterns, in rhythms, like some monstrous machine churning out death. We learned to read the sounds. The whistle meant it was close. The thud meant it had landed. The soldiers on the other side must have taken a break in the evenings, because things would fall strangely silent after dark. That's when we could finally eat. Our supply wagon only came under the cover of night. That evening, I was tasked with fetching food for our crew. I crossed to the other side of the village with one of our gunners, and what we found there, I still see it in my mind. Not a single house was left standing. The village had been wiped off the map. Doors, roofs, livestock, gone. Chimneys stood like headstones over smouldering ruins. The smell of ash, scorched fabric, and human flesh hung in the air like a curtain. We moved through what had once been gardens and doorways, now just blackened shapes. That walk changed me. I'd seen death before, but never like this. So clean, so final. You don't forget sights like that. The next morning, we woke to the sound of tanks. British tanks, close. It was the 2nd of August. The barrage began again at 0400, this time heavier, more concentrated. A full-scale attempt to finish us off. We were told that thousands of shells hit our lines all at once. I remember lying there inside the Tiger, our heads bowed low, waiting for it to end. The roar outside was deafening, but what I remember most was the silence inside. Not a word. Just breath and heartbeat. We braced for impact, but nothing could prepare you for the collapse of a building next to us. It came down like a curtain of stone and dust, burying men alive. One of the tanks in our 4th platoon was hit. The side armor plating folded in like paper, and the driver's leg, his name was Schenk, was severed instantly. He screamed and bled to death before we could reach him. You never forget the sound of a man bleeding out in a steel box. I still hear it sometimes at night. What shocked us was that despite everything, our tank was still running. The Tiger's armor had held, and we fought back. We fired into the smoke, blind, waiting for targets to emerge. We couldn't tell enemy from ally at times. The infantry around us were being cut to pieces, caught in crossfire or buried in sudden barrages. We tried to reverse, but one of our treads caught debris. It took 30 minutes just to get moving again. By the time the shelling stopped, we were surrounded. Small enemy squads had infiltrated through the gardens and hedgerows. I saw one group of about 15 enemy soldiers suddenly appear on the far side of the wall next to our tank. At first, I thought they were our own, but then I saw the shape of their helmets. Canadian. A firefight erupted almost immediately. We had to fight at close quarters, through smoke, through shock. I remember seeing one Canadian raise his hands. He must have thought he was outnumbered. We shouted for him to come forward, and he did. Others followed. They were young, just boys, chewing gum, terrified but proud. They'd been told we'd kill them on sight, but we didn't. We took our first prisoners that morning. They surrendered, and so did the rest of their squad. We gave them water, we gave them cigarettes, and in return we were allowed to recover our wounded. There were so many dead, so many still bleeding. We couldn't bury them. We just carried them aside and waited for the next barrage. In August 1944, we had just moved into position in a patch of woods. Not even a forest, really, just a thin belt of trees, barely enough to conceal a vehicle. We dug ourselves a foxhole under the branches and rolled our vehicle on top of it for cover. The sun hadn't even fully risen when the section commanders called us up. There was no time to settle, no time to breathe. We were ordered to report to the company commander. Our objective, a small village just a few kilometers away. The British had taken it during the night. Our task was to take it back. We moved out fast, a mix of infantry and assault guns. Some of the men climbed onto the tanks, gripping whatever they could to hold on. The rest of us jogged behind in loose formation, rifles slung, eyes darting. The village lay just beyond a ridge, but we didn't make it far before the first mortar rounds came in. We dove for cover, not that there was much, and squeezed under the assault guns like sardines under steel. The earth shook as rounds exploded around us. I remember looking over and seeing a young soldier, barely 18, curled into a ball under the tracks. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear a word. When the barrage lifted, we regrouped and pressed forward along a narrow road that passed under a low railway bridge. As we crept through, 2 Sherman tanks appeared just 50 meters ahead. There was no time to think. One of our assault guns fired, and the round hit dead on. Flames erupted from the first Sherman's turret. The second tried to reverse, but another round slammed into its side. Both tanks were destroyed within seconds. It was the only moment of the day that felt like victory. We moved into a hamlet near the village. As I turned the corner of a house, I came face to face with one of our own assault guns, just as it fired. The blast knocked me off my feet, a shockwave of heat and pressure that seemed to tear the air apart. My ears rang. My chest felt like it had caved in. I staggered back, coughing, patting myself down, convinced I'd been hit. Then the hatch of the gunner's compartment opened. A grinning face looked down and shouted, "What's the matter, lad? Did you think you got hit?" We didn't have time to laugh. Moments later, machine gun fire erupted from the other side of the street. We hit the ground, returned fire, and advanced in short bursts, door to door, wall to wall. Smoke clung to the village like fog. A white flag appeared in one window. A hand came out. We shouted for them to come out. Slowly they did. Over 80 enemy soldiers. Some carried their wounded. There was an officer, British, holding a pistol by the lanyard. He refused to surrender it, arrogant to the end. One of our men had enough, stepped forward, took out a trench knife, and sliced the lanyard. The officer didn't flinch. His face was stone. A comrade of mine pulled the pistol from his belt anyway. No more negotiation, no more honor, just survival. After the prisoners were disarmed, I walked around the edge of a ruined farmhouse and saw a man crawling forward. He was wounded, dragging himself by the elbows, one hand clutching a blood-soaked bandage around his neck. An Englishman. I crouched beside him. He looked up and tried to speak. Then he saw my uniform and went quiet. Another man, one of ours, arrived a moment later and looked down at him. The Englishman flinched, but instead of finishing him, the man offered a sip of water. We weren't animals, not all the time. Eventually, we got them on their feet, those who could stand, and started marching them back toward the rear lines. As we moved, we kept yelling, "Hands high! Hands up!" A single twitch, a single wrong movement, and it would be over. I saw one man lower his hands slightly and get slammed against a wall by a guard. Everyone was on edge. I was too. Every shadow looked like a sniper. Every sound, a shot. But we made it. And when we finally handed the prisoners over, we were each given a captured ration pack. English, chocolate, white bread, even toilet paper. I hadn't seen any of those things in months. For a few moments it felt like we were human again. Then we heard the sound of an approaching vehicle, and we all tensed. Just like that, it was back to war. By early September 1944, we were scattered. I had found myself along the Route de Paris, about 10 kilometers outside the town of Herson. There was no structure anymore, no regiment, no battalion, just knots of men clinging together, most of them lost, exhausted, filthy, and unsure of where the front even was. We had marched all night, the last surviving fragments of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. Percy had broken the division. Falaise had crushed it. The artillery regiment was gone. The flak detachment, gone. We were the dregs, survivors from the armoured grenadiers, a few paratroopers who had wandered in from the Fallschirmjäger, even a couple men from Panzer who had become separated. One of us, I think, was from a training unit, still had chalk on his boots from the classroom. At around 4 a.m, we were told to move. An SS Untersturmführer pointed to a map and said we'd be advancing. Advancing, he called it, toward a barn near a crossroad about 800 meters away. We were told to get a Panther running, one that had been abandoned near the tree line, and follow his orders. When I arrived, the tank was intact but cold. We managed to siphon fuel from a wrecked half-track and got it moving again. It was like reawakening a steel beast. The sound of the engine roaring to life in that empty, burning countryside was something I'll never forget. We were told to expect Americans near the crossroads, maybe scouts, maybe an advance column. I drove the Panther forward, past the last remaining hedgerows, with a few men trailing behind. Some were carrying captured British Sten guns. Others had no weapons at all, just grenades tucked into their belts. The fields were wet with dew, the roads littered with debris. By 1800 hours, we came under fire. The Americans hit us hard, anti-tank shells and rifle fire from what looked like a full company. The Panther took one hit, then another. A few of our men fell beside the tank, some screaming, others silent, dead before they hit the ground. I remember trying to turn the tank, to back us out of range, but we had no visibility and no spotter. I was yelling into the intercom, the gunner was shouting something back, and then the radio went dead. We reversed blindly, crashing through an orchard wall. Later, we were told to pull out completely, abandon the position and move toward the River Maas. We moved in groups, some by foot, some using bicycles we found discarded in ditches. That night, we camped in the ruins of a farmhouse, huddled near the hearth like ghosts, eating cold rations and sleeping with rifles across our chests. I remember waking up to the sound of a distant church bell. The village must have been occupied, but no one dared go closer. At one point, we came across a group of British prisoners. There were about 80 of them, huddled in a makeshift pen, their boots muddy, their faces blank. One of our men, who had a bit of English, told them to stand. One officer refused. He was well-dressed, arrogant, probably still thought the war would turn back in their favour. Another comrade stepped forward, took out a knife, sliced the officer's lanyard clean off, and took his sidearm. The officer never blinked. That silence, that mutual defiance, it hung in the air for the rest of the day. Eventually we turned them over to rear command. We didn't mistreat them. If anything, we envied them. They had food, cigarettes, even soap. The following morning, I found myself behind the wheel of a captured vehicle, a British truck someone had left running in a field. We piled in, stacked with stolen crates of food, and drove back toward the Maas. There were rumours of a new line being formed, rumours of surrender, rumours of nothing at all. That night, we slept under hedges. No blankets. Just the earth, the stars, and the thought that we were the last men left. On the 5th of September, we reached the Maas. There, we met others, stragglers, just like us. Some had swum across, others had found a bridge still intact. I walked the last kilometre barefoot, having sold my boots to a Belgian farmer for bread. We crossed under moonlight, our rifles raised above our heads, boots slung over shoulders, silent except for the breathing. That river was our border. Beyond it was Germany. Home. But it didn't feel like home. We rested briefly in a woodline, eating captured chocolate and white bread from British ration packs. Some even laughed for the first time in days. Then we heard it. A vehicle. A British Bren gun carrier, creeping up the road. We opened fire. The crew bailed instantly and ran into the trees. We stood there, weapons ready, watching. No counterattack came. Nothing. Just the wind in the leaves and the silence of men who knew the war was already lost. By the time we reached the rear zones, I no longer cared who was in command. I never saw most of those men again. Some slipped away. Some were folded into new units. Some simply disappeared. What I remember is that final march, cold, bitter, barefoot, dragging what little was left of our war behind us. And when I think of the war now, I don't think of flags or victory speeches or medals. I think of muddy boots, of looted chocolate, of a British pistol handed over with pride by a man who wouldn't kneel. And I think of the Panther tank I left idling on the edge of a field, still warm, still running, pointed west, waiting for orders that would never come. It was somewhere near the Ardennes, early January 1945. I don't remember the exact day. The snow had turned to slush by then, and our boots had begun to rot from the constant damp. I was part of a mixed Kampfgruppe, mostly men from what was left of our Panzergrenadier battalion, plus stragglers from 2 other regiments who had lost their command structure. No one really knew who was in charge anymore. Orders came scribbled on torn map sheets, passed from hand to hand by runners who were often younger than the rifles they carried. We hadn't slept in 2 days. Every time we tried, the artillery would start again. Sometimes it was ours. Usually it wasn't. We were holding a village, or what had once been a village. I don't remember the name. Just that it had a bakery, and that the bakery had a stone basement, and that was where we all slept. 8 men crammed into a space meant for flour sacks. One of them had trench foot so bad he couldn't walk. Another was deaf in one ear after a shell exploded too close. The rest of us were just cold and bitter. The Americans were close. You could hear them at night. The low rumble of Shermans moving along the roads. The occasional burst of English voices calling out to each other. We never answered. We knew what would happen if they found us. That night we were ordered to move forward to a tree line about 300 meters from the village. Recon had reported infantry massing there. I was on the MG team. We set up just behind a collapsed stone wall, covered the barrel with a scarf to muffle the shine. The snow had frozen into a sheet of ice. Every step cracked like bone. They came just before dawn. Not a charge, just shadows moving through the trees, slow and deliberate. We waited until they were within 50 meters, then opened fire. It was chaos. My loader fumbled with the belts. The gun jammed twice. I cleared it with numb fingers, heart hammering in my chest like I was 20 floors above the ground with no railing. One of the Americans dropped his rifle and tried to run. I saw another crawl behind a log, his foot twitching every few seconds like he was dreaming. We kept firing. They fell back eventually, dragging what bodies they could. When it was over, there were 7 corpses frozen in place. Some had tried to hide behind trees. One had been hit in the stomach and bled out slowly, judging by the trail he left. The others had simply fallen where they stood. We were ordered to hold the position. No one came to relieve us. That night we wrapped ourselves in damp blankets and tried to melt snow in our helmets for water. I found a photograph in one of the dead men's pockets. A woman and a boy standing by a car. The boy was holding a baseball glove. I stared at it for a long time before sliding it into my pack. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to remember that they were human. Or maybe I was just afraid that I wasn't. 2 days later, we were pushed back. The artillery started again. A rolling wall of noise that never seemed to end. One of our trucks overturned trying to navigate a frozen bend. I watched 3 men die trying to right it. Their legs snapped like matchsticks under the weight. When we finally abandoned the village, we left everything behind. Spare ammunition, wounded comrades, even one of our own tanks. Abandoned because it had no fuel. We scattered into the forest, heads low, rifles slung. No formation, no plan. That was the last time I fought as part of a proper unit. After that, it was all small pockets of resistance, hiding in barns, stealing civilian clothes, eating whatever we could find. I once spent 3 nights alone in the attic of a farmhouse, hiding under insulation, because American patrols kept sweeping the road below. I never surrendered, I just stopped fighting. We were told to hold the west bank of the Rhine. No specifics, no map coordinates, just hold it. The last real city before the river was Cologne, and by March 1945 it was already gone. What hadn't been hit by bombs had been burned, and what hadn't been burned had been looted. You could walk for 10 minutes and not see another living soul. Just crows, broken glass, and the echo of boots on empty streets. Our unit was mostly Waffen-SS in name only. By then, we were a patchwork of replacements, walking wounded, and teenage auxiliaries. No tanks, no radios, just whatever rifles we could scrounge and a few rusted MG-34s. I carried a checkmate rifle, bolt action, with a cracked stock. It misfired twice a day, but was the only one I'd managed to find after my last one was taken off a dead friend in the woods near Ardennes. We were dug in around a collapsed tram station near the Hohenzollern Bridge. The Americans had already crossed south of Remagen, and we knew Cologne would fall. It was only a matter of time. The last trains out had been shelled on the tracks. There was no point retreating. The officers had either disappeared or gone mad. One of them wandered into no man's land with a white armband and never came back. So we waited, and when the Americans came, it wasn't like the movies. There was no grand charge, no trumpet blast, just a slow, steady pressure. Shermans moving up the street like steel houses, infantry taking cover behind stone fountains and cratered roads. They moved like they had all the time in the world. You could hear them shouting to each other in English, casually, like they were on exercise. We fired from basements and doorways. I remember seeing a young American stumble through the dust with his hands in the air. No weapon. He was shot anyway, by someone 2 houses down. I don't know who. It didn't matter anymore. There were no rules, only survival. That night, I was posted with an MG team inside a church that had lost its roof. The stained glass had all been blown out, and broken saints lay in pieces across the floor. We'd set up the gun on the altar, pointed toward the street. The wooden pews were stacked as cover, and candles from the crypt still burned in the corners, lit by some old woman who had stayed behind to pray. I never saw her leave. Around midnight, tracer fire lit up the nave. Muzzle flashes danced through the ruins. Our assistant gunner was hit in the jaw. He fell without making a sound, and the blood kept pumping even after he'd gone limp. We kept firing anyway. 2 belts, then 3. The barrel glowed, my hands blistered. When we finally pulled back, we left him there. No time to bury, no time to say anything. Just one last look and then into the tunnels beneath the city, following old utility maps toward the river. We crawled through rats, filth, collapsed tiles. One man had a wounded leg and kept biting down on a belt to keep from screaming. We had no morphine left. He eventually passed out. We carried him. The last time I saw the city, I was standing in a rain of ash, staring up at the dome of the cathedral, which was somehow still standing. Everything else around it was rubble. Men moved like ghosts through the alleys. Scavengers? Deserters? Maybe soldiers, maybe not. At that point, the line between them didn't exist anymore. We crossed the Rhine by night, using a footbridge partially destroyed. One slip would have meant drowning, but we were too tired to care. On the east bank, there were no units waiting, no officers, no trucks. Just a handful of Feldgendarmerie asking where we'd come from. We didn't even bother answering. I never received another formal order after that. I never saw Cologne again. By the time the Americans took it fully, we were already walking east in small groups, trying to find anyone who still wore the same uniform. There was no front anymore, only direction. We had 3 tanks left. All Panthers, all patched together with salvage parts and driven by boys who hadn't seen real training in months. The Americans were already across the Rhine, and the orders we received were simple: delay the spearhead near Paderborn at all costs. I was the loader in one of those Panthers. Our commander was Rottenführer Albrecht, 26, already half deaf from a shell that had landed near his cupola in Normandy. The driver, Keller, was 18. He'd only ever driven farm tractors before the war. Our gunner, Dietz, had come from Panzerlehr and had fought at Villers-Bocage, or so he claimed. He never spoke much, just smoked and stared at the optics, like the glass showed more than just targets. We rolled out at dawn. The weather was grey, low cloud cover, and the roads were a mess, thawing mud, abandoned carts, horses half-eaten by scavengers. Somewhere north of us, elements of the 3rd Armoured Division were pushing forward with Shermans and Pershings. We didn't expect to survive, but still, the tank was home. You felt different inside it, not safer, just sealed off from the rest of the dying world. By mid-morning, we were dug in behind a hedgerow overlooking a crossroads. A Panther from the 2nd Company had set up about 200 metres to our left. It had no coaxial machine gun, ripped out in Belgium and never replaced. The crew waved once, I remember that, just a single gloved hand from the turret, nothing else. Around 1100 we heard engines, low, fast. American tanks. At least 5 Shermans, spaced neatly, with half-tracks and infantry moving behind them. Textbook spacing. Our commander ordered silence until they crossed the first bend. Then Dietz opened fire. First shell hit clean, side of the lead Sherman. Flames burst from the turret ring, and the tank rolled into a ditch, its commander trying to climb out before collapsing backward, engulfed in smoke. Second shot missed, glanced off the glacis of a second Sherman, which immediately returned fire. The hedgerow exploded beside us, not a direct hit, but enough to rattle our bones. Then they brought in a Pershing. We hadn't seen one up close before. It moved slower than the Shermans, but its silhouette was unmistakable. Longer barrel, boxier turret, heavier tracks. Our commander cursed. We knew we couldn't face it directly. The 75mm gun on our Panther could punch through at close range, but not head-on, not at distance. Albrecht ordered reverse, slow, deliberate. We backed down the slope, but they had spotted us. A round struck the mantlet. Sparks flew inside the turret. The breech glowed red-hot. My ears rang like a church bell in a storm. Dietz kept firing, breathing through clenched teeth. One of our shells finally struck the Pershing low, near the suspension. The tank rocked, stopped. Smoke poured from the engine deck. It didn't explode, but it didn't move either. Then the infantry came. Keller gunned the engine and tried to pivot, but the left track was jammed. Mud and frozen brush clogged the drive sprockets. We were a sitting duck. I grabbed my MP-40 and climbed halfway out the hatch, firing wildly into the trees. A grenade landed near the hull and went off. Shrapnel tore across the rear plate. Keller was screaming. The inside of the tank filled with smoke and oil vapour. We abandoned it. Dietz and I pulled Keller out by his belt, half-dragged him through the woods. Albrecht never made it out. Last we saw of him, he was slumped over the cupola, blood running down the side of the turret. The second Panther had already been destroyed, burning in a ditch, crew nowhere in sight. Maybe they burned with it. We regrouped with another 3 men from a Volksgrenadier unit hiding in a barn. One had a flare gun and nothing else. We waited there for 2 days, sleeping on hay, watching American half-tracks pass just meters from the door. They didn't check the barn. They didn't need to. The war was already over, and we were no longer worth the ammunition. When we finally surrendered, it was to a unit from the 83rd Infantry Division. They were polite, even respectful. One of them offered me a cigarette. I hadn't smoked since December. I asked him where he was from. He said Ohio. That night, I sat in the back of a captured truck and looked up at the sky, wondering how many of our men were still alive, and if any of them would even remember what we had tried to do. We weren't heroes. We were just the last crew of a forgotten Panther, left behind on a muddy road in a war that had already moved on. They were Canadians this time. We could tell by the way they moved. Slower than the Americans, more cautious, but precise. The ones near Falaise weren't new to war. We had seen their kind before in Italy and along the Orne. They weren't eager. They were thorough. It was the second week of August, and the sky hadn't been quiet in days. Every time we looked up, it was full of smoke and black specks. Fighters, spotters, sometimes bombers. Our Kampfgruppe had been thrown together from remnants of 2 SS regiments and what was left of the Divisional Signals Company. No more trucks, no armoured support, just rifles, Panzerfausts, and a few MGs we dug out of burned-out half-tracks. We were somewhere south of Bretteville-le-Rabais. The names didn't matter anymore. It was just another Norman village with 2 streets and a church missing its bell tower. That's where we made our stand. Inside the rubble, behind broken garden walls, in cellars that still smelled of apple wine and wet plaster. We had 11 men, none of us over 25. The youngest was 16, a Volkssturm boy who said he'd been trained to use a Mauser by shooting at fence posts behind his school. He was assigned to carry spare belts for the MG team. He never made a sound, just stared. The shelling started at dawn, not heavy, just probing barrages, enough to shake the walls and drive the rats from the cellars. Then the Bren gun carriers came, moving low and fast along the hedgerows. They stopped short of the village. After that, infantry. I saw them through the broken slats of a barn wall. Khaki uniforms, netted helmets, rifles slung at the hip. Quiet, focused. The first shot came from Müller's MG, cut down a section as they crossed the lane. One man rolled into the ditch. Another dropped behind a wheelbarrow and didn't move again. We waited. Then the smoke came. They used it well. Thick curtains of grey that drifted into the alleys and fields, blocking every line of sight. We fired blind. Return fire came fast. Sharp, precise, not random. They had snipers. One of our men, Janik, was hit while shifting position. The bullet went through his helmet and out the side of his neck. He fell backwards without a sound, just slumped against the wall. We left him where he dropped. By noon, they were inside the village. You could hear their boots on the rubble, the clang of weapons against stone. English and French commands shouted in low voices. One of them threw a grenade into the back door of the house we were in. It didn't go off. A dud. We didn't wait for the next. We slipped out through the cellar and into the orchard behind the barn. There we found 2 more of our men, one wounded, holding his stomach. He tried to stand. We carried him between us until we reached a hedge line. There we spotted a Sherman angled toward the main road, its commander scanning the rooftops through binoculars. We froze. The hatch was open, but the machine gun was manned. We circled wide, crawling through manure, broken stone and irrigation ditches. Everything reeked of mud and burning oil. A Canadian carrier had been knocked out earlier in the day, and the air still carried the stink of scorched rubber and fuel. Flies buzzed around the remains of a body in the road. I don't know which side he was from. Half the face was gone. By evening, we had regrouped near a field hospital, if you could call it that. Just a dugout in the tree line, with a Red Cross flag made from torn linen and boot polish. There was no morphine, just rags and boiled water. The wounded man we carried in died sometime after sunset. I remember someone covering his face with a torn sandbag. That night we listened as the Canadians moved through the village. No looting, no shouting, just discipline. I had expected hatred. Instead, it was just efficiency. They cleared houses, checked corpses, marked walls with chalk, then moved on. We slipped away after midnight. 3 of us left. We didn't speak, just kept walking, barefoot through the fields, using the stars and the sound of retreating artillery to guide us east. We stopped being a division sometime around the 23rd of August. Nobody said it out loud. The map still had our unit symbols printed neatly. 2. SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the best formations Germany had ever fielded, or so they said. But those symbols didn't mean anything anymore. The Panthers were gone, the fuel was gone, the officers were gone. All that remained were small groups of us, walking, crawling, hiding, moving east in whatever direction didn't smell like fire. We were supposed to hold the southern corridor open, the last gap near Chambois, through which what was left of our army could escape, but it had already closed. The Poles had reached Mont Ormel, Hill 262, and from there they could see the entire valley floor. And they had artillery. It was slaughter. The road out was lined with the corpses of horses and men, vehicles burned like funeral pyres. Somewhere in that chaos, someone was still giving orders, but by the time they reached us, they were scribbled in pencil on torn ration cards and carried by boys who could barely grow facial hair. I hadn't seen a regimental commander in 4 days. Our group was 9 men, 4 from my old platoon, 2 signals men who'd lost their radio gear, 1 machine gunner from Totenkopf, and 2 supply drivers whose truck had been hit by a typhoon earlier in the week. They were armed with a captured Sten gun and a flare pistol. That's how bad it was. We didn't have a radio, no anti-tank weapons, just rifles and what few grenades we'd scavenged off the dead. My boots were falling apart, wrapped with twine. We had 1 water canteen between us. The others had been lost in the chaos, torn from belts, abandoned during airstrikes, or stolen by others in the night. We hadn't eaten in 2 days. The fields we moved through were open, flat, wet, and full of wreckage, burned half-tracks with their steel twisted into unnatural shapes. I saw one that had been torn open like a sardine can, its crew still inside, frozen mid-motion, their skin blackened, lips cracked. We didn't touch it. We didn't look too long, just kept walking. If you stopped to grieve for every corpse, you'd never make it out. There were horses everywhere, dead or dying. Guts spilled in the grass, twisted in barbed wire, or bloated and buzzing with flies. Most of the transport columns had been destroyed by air attacks. The few wagons that made it through were soon abandoned. I saw a driver try to unbuckle a horse under fire. He took a round in the chest and fell backward into the ditch, eyes wide open. His horse stood there another 10 seconds before being shredded by shrapnel. I remember that the silence after an airstrike, that terrible vibrating stillness, no birds, no wind, just the click of cooling metal and the soft drip of blood onto the earth. We moved at night, always, never in the open during daylight. The skies were never empty, If not bombers, then fighters, always circling. You could tell when they were close by the way the crows scattered. It became instinct. When the crows lifted, you dropped. One night, we crossed paths with a group of artillerymen. They had no guns left, just one wheel from a field piece being used as a makeshift cart for a wounded man. His legs were gone. He was barely conscious. His comrades said they were taking him east to the field hospital. There was no field hospital, not anymore. We didn't say anything, just nodded and moved on. Sometimes silence was mercy. We avoided villages unless absolutely necessary. The civilians had turned. Some were still afraid, still compliant, but others, especially the younger ones, saw that we were finished. In one hamlet, we were offered milk by a farmer's wife. 20 minutes later, artillery hit our position. Someone had a radio. Someone had talked. In another village, a Frenchman tried to shoot us with a hunting rifle from the window of a barn. Missed. We kicked the door in, and the youngest in our group, just 17, shot him in the gut without thinking. We didn't stay to see if he lived. It was the kind of war now where everyone had blood on their hands, even the ones who didn't fire a shot. On the 22nd, we tried to cross the Dives River. The bridge was out, destroyed by engineers. The water was dark, choked with wreckage and bodies. A drowned horse floated belly up near the bank, bloated and torn. We found a small rowboat, barely intact, and used it to ferry ourselves and our gear across, 2 at a time. One of our men slipped on the bank and vanished under the water. We waited, rifles ready, but he never surfaced. We moved on. That night we reached a rise overlooking the valley. Fires burned in every direction. The smell of fuel and ash was inescapable. Distant shelling lit the sky like lightning. I remember sitting beside a wall, watching the horizon flicker, and realizing I hadn't spoken in hours. No one had. There was nothing left to say. At some point we stopped thinking of ourselves as Das Reich. That name meant something once. In Kharkov, in Kursk, it meant elite, feared, respected. But not now. Not here. Now we were just shadows in the mud, trying to stay alive. No one was going to rescue us. No new orders were coming. We were on our own. We reached the German lines sometime on the 24th, what was left of them. Just a few Feldgendarmerie manning a checkpoint near Argentan, checking dog tags, taking names. One of them asked what unit we were from. None of us answered. He didn't press, just waved us through. We collapsed in a ditch just past the checkpoint, staring at the sky. There were stars again. I hadn't seen stars in weeks. That was the end of Das Reich for me. Not Berlin. Not a heroic last stand. Just a silent retreat through fields full of ash and wire, with no one left to give orders and no reason left to follow them.